And I think we're live on YouTube now. So, for those watching online and on repeat, my name is Robert Reid. I work at the Albert Park headquarters. Today, we're having a National Assembly held online to outline kind of thoughts and ideas about what we can replace the council tax with. Of course, council tax is the most regressive form of taxation. We've, as a party, have always taken a strong stance against it. In the 2022 council elections, we argued for a council tax freeze, and since then, party policy at conference has been to scrap the unfair council tax. The purpose for this meeting and perhaps subsequent meetings will be to kind of identify policy areas and substitutes and replacements for the council tax. And so tonight you will hear from Tommy Sheridan, who was a former MSP, who is to date the only person to bring forward a bill to the Scottish Parliament seeking to scrap and replace the unfair council tax. And so I think Tommy tonight will kind of outline his position, perhaps on his bill, what has changed since then, what his view is now. Perhaps it might be the same. And we'll also hear from Councillor Andy Doig of Renfrewshire Council. He's an independent councillor, supports independence, and is part of the group of eight councillors, independent councillors from across Scotland that have backed Alba ahead of the next election. So Andy is running slightly late right now. He's set due to his civic duties. He says he'll be in at 7:15, so we'll try and hold him to that. So for that reason, we'll start with Tommy. And it's, I think we agreed 10, 15 minutes to kind of outline what your thoughts are, and then we can open up to any questions and see if Andy's here. So Tommy, on you go.
Thanks very much, Robert. I thought it was maybe an hour and 10 or 15 minutes I was getting, but hey, I'll just try and curtail it as best I can. Can I just thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to speak to other Alba members and others who are interested in this subject in relation to abolition of council tax and what we replace it with. Can I say right from the outset, if you are interested in some of the details and the context of which I'm going to talk about tonight, please use the resource. It's a fantastic resource, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, SPICE. If you're looking for it, just put SPICE and then abolition of council tax, and it will bring up all of the documents that were introduced in relation to the proposal that I lodged in September of 2003, which was then introduced as a bill in November of 2003 and then was debated in Parliament on the 1st of February of 2006. So please, if you get the opportunity, have a look at those papers, because the bill that I'm going to talk about here tonight was subjected to intense scrutiny by the Scottish Parliament Local Government Committee and the Finance Committee. And I have to say right from the outset that the overwhelming criticism was about the redistributive nature of the tax proposal that I wished to introduce. The biggest fear that was expressed over and over and over again was the flight of the millionaires, that if we introduced a tax along the lines of which I was proposing, then millionaires would leave Scotland. I said during the parliamentary debate that I think we should help arrange their travel. I don't think it is something that should hold us to ransom in Scotland, and that if millionaires wish to live and work in Scotland, as many of them do, because they're tied very much to the country, then the idea of paying their fair share of taxation should not be something that frightens them. After all, if they are as patriotic as they say they are, then surely they shouldn't avoid a tax system that is redistributive. The proposal that I introduced was to replace a tax which Robert has already referred to as a regressive tax. The council tax, just to remind us all, is a tax that was introduced on the back of Thatcher being turfed out of office as the PM because her hated poll tax had failed. And it failed not because of anything she did or anybody else did. It failed because millions of people across Scotland and then eventually in England and Wales refused to pay it. We made it unworkable. That was the word that was used by John Major in Parliament when he announced the scrapping of the poll tax was it had become uncollectible. Well, it never became uncollectible because of any admin problem. It became uncollectible because people refused to pay it. It was an unfair, immoral piece of legislation and it deserved to be opposed. And I would argue, in many respects, the SNP probably came of age as a political party during that period because they had the courage to back the non-payment campaign, whereas every other mainstream party in Scotland, including the trade unions, ran from that campaign because it meant breaking the law. As I said many times during that period, it was much better to break the law than break the poor. That was the Popular Council slogan in the 1920s when they stood against poverty, and it became our slogan during the anti-poll tax campaign. So that's an essential bit of background to where the council tax was introduced. And the truth is, we have to hold our hands up and say that we bear some of the responsibility because many of us were involved in the anti-poll tax campaign, but we weren't so keen and we weren't so forward in bringing forward alternatives. We knew what we didn't want, but we allowed the Tories to fill the vacuum. And what they did is they filled the vacuum with a property tax that was inherently unfair right from the outset, based on 1991 property valuations. The biggest variation in the 8 bands that they introduced, the biggest variation in income was just over a 3-to-1 multiplier, so that the very poorest person in Scotland would only ever pay 3 times less the very richest person in Scotland. And, right from the outset, if you think about multi-millionaires being 100 and 250 times better off than most people, when it came to council tax, they were only ever paying 3 times more in council tax. So ordinary poor people paid more as a proportion of their income than the rich and the wealthy. So it became a very regressive proposal right from the outset. And I was the convener of the Scottish Socialist Party at the time, and along with economists from Paisley University, a guy called Mike Danson, a guy called Jeff Whittam, and an accountant called Christine Cooper, we worked collectively to try and develop an alternative. What would be an alternative to the council tax? What we come up with, and I know that there are other alternatives and they all have to be listened to and subjected to analysis. What we come up with was a progressive form of income tax. And you'll notice I never said local income tax. And there's a reason why I've not called it a local income tax. I've called it a local tax because it would be dedicated. The money raised from this Scottish service tax would be dedicated to pay for local government services. That's why it was called the Scottish Services Tax. We recognise right from the outset that if you were to introduce a form of local income tax, which is what the Liberals and the SNP used to back, then you are facing a massive problem in terms of admin and a massive problem in terms of flight. Because the flight from one local authority to another is much easier than the flight from a country to another. And what I mean by that is if you have a local income tax, there's 32 local authorities in Scotland. If every one of them has their own local income tax, each of them will have to have their own administration system to raise that local income tax. But the problem is, and you look at the situation with the council tax, the poorest areas in Scotland have the highest council taxes. Why? Because they've got the biggest problem. They've got the biggest demand for services. What you would have with a local income tax, if it was set locally, is you would have the richest areas, the East Wrens, the Eastern Bartons, would have a lower local income tax than Glasgow, Dundee, Inverclyde, because they would be able to set their tax at a lower level because the demand in their services is less than the demand in the services in the poorest areas. So a local income tax would become regressive and wouldn't be redistributive. What we proposed was a set of 5 income tax rates. The first rate, and obviously these are figures that were related to 2003. You would need to update these figures now. I don't think we necessarily need to update the percentages, but 0 to 10,000. So if your income's less than 10,000, you were automatically exempt from the Scottish service tax. And at the time when we introduced this proposal, that included over 400,000 pensioner households who, rather than facing council tax bills that were crippling for them, would be exempt. And it'd be an automatic exemption, not a means-tested exemption. You then have a 4.5% tax for 10 to 30,000. You then have a 15% tax from 30 to 50,000. You then have an 18% tax, 50 to 90,000. And for 90,000 and beyond, you have a 20% tax rate. Now, hopefully everybody understands that when we're talking about marginal tax rates, that doesn't mean that someone who's on £95,000 a year is subjected to a 20% tax on all of them 90,000. It's only a 20% tax on the proportion of their income that's above the 50,000 level. So it's marginally applied. People often come out with, oh, you can't have 20%. That means my whole income is going to be subject to that. And that's not the way marginal tax rates actually work. What it would mean, according to all of the analysis of the figures, is that the average worker, the nurse, the teacher, the police officer, would pay less in the service tax, even though there was 2 bills. Even though there are 2 incomes being taxed, they would pay less on average in service tax than they were paying in council tax. The people who would be paying more would be those on incomes in excess of 90, 100, 150,000 pounds a year. But because of the progressive nature of the tax, it meant that certain individuals, I'm trying to remember from my speech in the Parliament, one of them was, I think he's now a Lord Elfrin, whose income was in those days about 4.8 million. He had about 48 million in the bank, and his council tax at the time was around £2,500. It would rise to 400,000. People would say, oh, wait a minute, how can you really afford that? This is a guy who donated 250,000 to the Tories. So if he can afford to donate £250,000 to the Tories, then he can afford to pay a higher tax bill. And I don't think we should be frightened about those figures. Multi-millionaires of that nature, it would work out at a tiny percentage of their income, much less than the effect it would have on the poorest people to continue with the council tax. Because the poorest people carry the burden of the council tax. The poorest people pay a higher proportion of their income in council tax than the very richest in society. The analysis and the figures for our service tax proposal showed that not only would the service tax raise money from people in a more progressive nature and save ordinary people money, teachers, police officers, train drivers, firefighters, all of whom on average would pay less, but it would also, and this was the additional point that was so important, it would raise 300 at the time, £300 million more for local government services than the council tax was raising at that time. So not only are we raising money in a fairer fashion, but we're raising more money so that we can afford more teachers, we can afford more refuge workers, we can afford more local services. Now, the biggest criticism, as I say, came from Labour politicians, believe it or not. The Tories obviously joined in, but Labour politicians who were saying, help my Bob, the rich will leave Scotland. You know, all of a sudden, the party that was formed by the workers was trying to defend the millionaires instead of the millions, which really pissed me off, and I'm sure you understand why. The second criticism, the biggest criticism that came from the SNP, became a huge hypocrisy. Because SNP, if I'm not mistaken, it was John Swinney who spoke to the bill in Parliament in 2006 on behalf of the SNP to oppose the proposal. And he said that he didn't attack the principle, but what he attacked was that it wasn't really a local income tax because it wasn't set locally, and therefore it's not a local income tax. And on that basis, they're going to vote against it. Now, those of you that were in the SNP at the time will perhaps recall that you then went into the 2007 election, and lo and behold, the local income tax proposal the SNP came forward was set centrally. The very argument that I had made in Parliament, which was dismissed in 2006, became accepted in 2007, that it was far too expensive administratively, and it would also have detrimental effects if you had 32 different rates of local income tax. Better to have one rate across the whole of Scotland, with the money collected either from each of the local authority areas, or my preference in the bill was the HMRC collects the money on behalf of each of the local authorities, distributes it to the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish Parliament then distributes the money to each of the local authorities based on need, based on demand for services, so that you have a much fairer form of distribution than what you have just now, which I'm afraid has to be well overhauled, because many of the systems that are used for distribution of money are completely out of date. So I recognise I'm going over my time already, and I'll try and bring these remarks to summation. I believe the Scottish service tax is still not just a fair proposal, but a viable proposal. It's a proposal that puts redistribution of wealth at the very heart of taxation, and it allows more money to be raised for local government jobs and services, but it allows it to be raised in a fairer fashion. We may wish, and I appealed for this at the first stage debate, I said to the Parliament, if you agree with the principle, but you think there are some things that need to be fine-tuned, some things that need to be amended, then vote for the principle, and then stage 2, stage 3 is when you fine-tune things, when you add things, subtract things, or whatever. That's what should have been done. Unfortunately, the SNP voted it down. There was 12 in favour, 94 against, and 12 abstentions. Sorry, 6 abstentions. From my point of view, I think it is important that political parties do what it says on the tin. The SSP was formed in 1998. We developed the service tax proposal in 2002. We fought the 2003 election with a very, very strong demand that we abolish the council tax and replace it with the service tax. And within months, I introduced the bill. September of 2003 is when I introduced the bill. To me, that's what political parties should do. When they say they're going to do something in an election, they do it. And that is important to me. It's worth making the point that the SNP, as you know, has hesitated over and over again and has refused to grasp this nettle, because a revaluation of properties isn't going to work. It'd be even worse. Council tax is based on 1991 valuations. I believe the average increase in valuation of property since then is 356%, according to the Institute for Scotland. 356%. So a revaluation of properties isn't going to work as far as council tax is concerned. It's not fit for purpose. It has to be replaced. And from my point of view, we have a service tax that is a form of income tax set nationally, applied across the country. So if you are a firefighter in Perth, then you pay the same as a firefighter in Paisley. And if you're a millionaire in Perth, you pay the same as a millionaire in Paisley. So that's the way I would like to see us go forward. But obviously, I'll need to take my chances at various ALBA forums and conferences and hopefully fight my corner.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tommy. It was really interesting. And so just remind folk, Andy Doig, Councillor Andy Doig from Renfrewshire Council is here. He was actually here before he said he was going to be here, which is fantastic. And so he will be speaking for the next 10, 15 minutes or so on the land value tax. And then after that, we'll go to questions from those in the kind of chat room here and anyone watching on YouTube as well. And so I'll pass over to Councillor Andy Doig.
Thanks very much, Robert. It's really good to be here, and it's really great to see Tommy again. Tommy and I are old political warhorses. I first met Tommy in 1987. I was the SNP candidate for Pollock at the general election. I actually had hair at that time. Tommy had hair as well. And our paths first crossed there, and our paths have crossed time and time again. And over the decades, despite the fact I was always in the SNP, I was always on the left of the party, and I think quite often we agreed on an awful lot of things. And I would like to say that I don't disagree with anything that Tommy has said here tonight. I don't obviously have the same detail about the service tax that he has, but I accept his main proposition, which is that it was argued for and examined in Holyrood, and that does mean that it's been under some level of scrutiny. He's right in what he says. I mean, to me, if I read ALAPA's main policy aim, apart from independence, is they want a social democratic programme. I think one of the ways as a party that it'd be useful to tackle the rise of the far right is you need to kind of reinvent social democracy for the 21st century. And I think one of the ways you can do that is look at measures like a Scottish service tax or a land value tax. Social democracy in the 21st century, in 2025, has to be redistributive. It has to be more teeth than it did in the 20th century. Most of the 20th century, even in the 50s, there was a lot of soft Tories who agreed with the main principle of the welfare state and the reforms brought in by the Attlee government. That all went when Thatcher came in. So, we need to be much more bullheaded and bullish, I think, about what we believe in terms of social policy. And I would agree with Tommy, redistribution is the only way to go, because when you put the argument to people on the street and say, do you not think it's fair if somebody earns a wee bit more, they should pay a wee bit more? 90% of the people will agree. And I have noticed in a UK context in recent years, there's actually been a group called Patriotic Millionaires. I'm delighted to see them, who have came out and said they agree. And maybe we need a Scottish version of Patriotic Millionaires to counter this kind of, it's just sloppy thinking about nonsense about, oh, the millionaires will leave. If they're really committed to the country they won't leave. And it's not the millionaires that necessarily create the wealth in any event. It's working people that create the wealth. But picking up on a land value tax, I became interested in this through listening to people like Graham McCormick, who's still in the SNP, and he's been arguing this case for quite a long time. One of my criticisms of the SNP and the way it's gone, and one of the biggest disappointments under devolution, is the land reform issue, because land is power, and you've got 430 families that control 40% of Scotland's land. Scotland is the only country in Europe that has a feudal, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean it in a literal sense. It's the only country in Europe that has got a feudal land system. The USA has a land tax, France has a land tax. It just makes sense. We need to tackle this inequality, and until we tackle that, and I'm so disappointed that while there's been some good work done in land reform by both Labour and the SNP in Holyrood, they've tended to tinker about the edges, and there's, as Tommy says, there's an inherent kind of fear. They're frightened to tackle the core issue. Now, I don't understand why, because the landed, the landed gentry are not going to be voting independents or voting for left of centre policies anytime soon. There's no lost votes in that camp. We never had them in the first place. So why there is this fear amongst some elements of the SNP, I won't say all. I don't understand it. I think it's just it's based on a lack of analysis. How would a land value tax work? Well, I don't have the same level of detail that people like Graham McCormick have the research that they have initiated. I think if you look at one of the interesting examples that I do know a wee bit about is Taiwan. Now, Taiwan's a very interesting Asian country. Like most East Asian countries, it's got a very buoyant private sector. It's one of the biggest producers of semiconductors in the world, which is probably one of the main reasons why China isn't going to invade anytime soon. But it also has an extremely effective and a public sector system. But the reason for that is the Kuomintang believed in a land value tax. They took this from the American influence that influenced Sun Yat-sen and then Chiang Kai-shek. So, I mean, they brought in a land value tax, and corporations and individuals need to pay this. And it works bloody well, because there's a high level of public services. It doesn't interfere with the kind of, it doesn't in any way have this anti-competitive effect on the economy that you see Tories and some people on the right of centre arguing about. It actually works very well. And we need I think Alapa has to be saying we want social democracy for the 21st century. We need to look at things like a land value tax. I'm not certain, and I don't know enough, and I'm going to hold my hand up here, Tommy. I don't know enough about a land value tax to say, would it be best to administer centrally? I can see exactly the points that you've made about the difficulties of administering a local income tax. What I would say about that is, given that most councils have got joint valuation boards, for example, Renfrewshire. Oops. Can you see me? Hello?
Yep, can still see you.
Okay, there's something happened here. Given that Renfrewshire, East Renfrewshire and Inverclyde have got a joint valuation board, there we are. I think there's a lot of what you've got is regional groupings. I don't know if Glasgow does that, Tommy, but I can imagine the Lothians would be a natural fit for a joint valuation board where they do a lot of joint things together in relation to things like business rates. If people wanted a more decentralised version, that would maybe be a way to go, where it wouldn't be decentralised to every single 32 local authority, but what it would be devolved to would be the 15 or so valuation tax areas made up of 2 or 3 authorities together. And I'm not necessarily advocating that. I'm just saying if Alapa found or felt they wanted to go down that road, it might not be as difficult as Tommy suggested if there's other ways of looking at it. I think really, as I say, we get to this point in politics where Tommy made a very good point. The SSP at the time, I remember the 2003 campaign, and they said what they did. They said what they did, and they did what was in the tin, and people voted for them out of respect. Now you can see what happens to parties when they turn their back on just about everything they've said less than a year earlier. You can see what happens there. Massive public disillusionment, and this is why you've got this movement to the far right. So we need to put forward coherent policies, tested policies. For me, the land, I don't think you can separate the land, a service tax or a land value tax from the land reform issue. Maybe that's a separate debate, Robert, I don't know. But for me, Labour tried it, the Liberals in their day tried it. We must tackle this feudal land system. It's holding Scotland back. It's one of the reasons why Scotland economically is as hampered as it is. And it's time that some party had the guts to come out and say that. And I'm hoping it'll be Alapa. I'll take any questions.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Andy. So we're happy to move to any questions of either, or general thoughts as well from anyone in the room, or comments online. And so one point I was going to ask Tommy, so I'll go first since I'm chairing, I guess. Would be with is one of the concerns with the service tax. I think Andy touched on it slightly there. Is the kind of centralisation of power, and would it not be seen as a backward step to take power away from the likes of Andy and Councillor Chris Cullen, for example, down
Andy
in.
doesn't have much power to begin.
But from local authorities by creating a kind of centralised tax system that would then replace council tax. Is that not a potential problem that you'd see, Tommy, with your proposal?
Robert, I think it's a reasonable question and it deserves to be asked and answered. The first answer would have to be that the current situation, councillors have very, very little power. Because the truth is, the council tax has been frozen several years in a row. So right away, the only form of involvement that councillors could have in how much the local authority raises would be to change the council tax level. Because believe it or not, and this was one of the issues which I raised at the Scottish Service Tax debate, we should devolve, if there's anything that should be devolved to local authorities, it's the ability to set business rates, local business rates. I mean, a lot of people in Scotland don't know this. Business rates are set nationally. Why on earth would you allow business rates to be set nationally when local authorities who have got a burden of maybe bigger businesses that use the roads a lot more for deliveries and it means the roads need to be prepared a lot more if they've got an abundance of buses. Why don't they allow local business rates to be set locally? And if business rates go up, then the local authority raises more. Business rates, they might choose to put them down. That's up to them. So right away, I would say to you, Robert, it's illusory. It is an illusion to suggest that local councils already have power that we're going to take away from them. They don't have. However, given that the Scottish Service Tax proposal would raise the global sum in Scotland and then redistribute that sum to each local authority, the local authority then decides how to spend their money that they're getting from that service tax proposal. And that is very akin to what happens with the business rate. They're allowed to decide how they spend their proportion of the business rate. So it's not a big shift at all. When I hear people talk about, oh, we're actually taking away local democracy, they really are out of touch with the fact that we don't really have local democracy. They already have very little powers. I mean, if you think of a local authority, I've not got enough money. Why don't we raise the council tax? Oh, wait a wee minute. Am I a turkey voting for Christmas or what? Because if I increase the council tax locally, what are people going to do at the next election? They're going to turf you out because you dared to try and raise more money by increasing the council tax. So from my point of view, Robert, I don't think, in many respects, we can have a quid pro quo. We can remove the centralisation of business rates and we can then have centralisation of service tax instead.
Great, thanks so much. Any further questions from anyone in the chat room? And I'll keep an eye on the YouTube comments. David? Unmute yourself. That's it.
Yeah, thanks. Couple of comments. First of all, I agree with most of what you were saying, Tommy. And I must admit, I had no idea about your proposal back in 2003. I wasn't really interested in politics at that time. But one thing that just thinking about it was that those with large land holdings wouldn't be taxed if it was just simply on the basis of their income. So people with equal incomes, but one living in somewhere in Glasgow and somebody else having an estate in the Highlands could be paying the same tax. And so there's less of a redistributive element in that situation. But the other thing that I worry about is that an income tax is so avoidable. People can have their, if you want to, you can have your tax paid in the Cayman Islands, and you then only declare whatever you decide you want to declare. And so therefore you are making it the amount you pay optional. And so what are your thoughts on those points?
Again, David, thanks for the question. Those issues were raised in the course of the analysis over the couple of years that the bill proposal was subjected to debate at two different parliamentary committees. And we had the Professor Mike Danson, Jeff Whittam, Christine Cooper in particular. They were all very involved with the Tax Justice Network. Some of you may be aware of the Tax Justice Network. There's a guy called Prem Sikka, who's now Lord Prem Sikka, who is a shit-hot accountant who writes papers about tax avoidance and how to deal with tax avoidance. So from my point of view, David, we know that certain people try and arrange their affairs to avoid tax. My question is, what are we going to do about it? I don't think we allow them to get away with it. We have this horrible, horrible situation in society, don't we? That we have big campaigns run by the DWP that we have to shop our neighbours if we know that they're on benefit but they're working in the local hairdressers. We get adverts in the bus stops. Remember the big adverts? We're on to you, trying to target anybody that dares to work a wee bit on the side while claiming benefits. We have this absolute dedication to curbing any benefit fraud, despite the fact that it represents 0.3%. 0.3% of the benefit budget, compared to the figure for non-payment of tax is in excess of £40 billion. So from my point of view, David, I think we tackle that question very aggressively, and that we employ enough inspectors and we get them educated via the accountants so that we actually clamp down in that type of tax avoidance, because it's theft from the public services.
You're quite right, and that's absolutely true. But what you say would only apply really after independence, because while we're still under Westminster's domination, they wouldn't allow that.
There's an element of what you say is correct, and I also have to, just before I forget, make the point that I don't look at this debate as an either or. This debate shouldn't be land value tax or service tax. I would like to see a combination, because the point you made earlier, we defined income in our bill as broadly as possible so that any income derived from land ownership becomes part of the service tax, right? So that it wasn't just income via wages that we were talking about. It was income via land, via shares, via stocks, so that we tried to make it as broad as possible. But that point that you've made there is very important. We would try and beef up the HMRC. They already have powers in Scotland in relation to tax avoidance. But in terms of the bigger picture, you're absolutely right. The independence, the powers, the economic powers that would be required to really tackle it are only going to come with independence. We could only scratch the surface just now. In a devolved settlement, in a devolved parliament. And I made that point clear in my speech to the parliament on the day, that what we needed wasn't just abolition of the council tax. What we needed was a democratic Scottish Socialist Republic. That's what we needed. But unfortunately, the bill was only meant to address the limited powers we do have. And some people, David, some people do make the point with a wee degree of legitimacy. And that is when they say to people like me, you want independence today, this, that, and the other. Why don't you use the powers that you've got to the full extent now? to try and redistribute wealth. And that is a legitimate concern. The Scottish Parliament has been far too meek and mild-mannered in its last 30 years. And that, I'm afraid, has undermined the credibility of the Scottish Parliament in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right,
Thank you.
thanks, David, so much for those questions. Andy, you've got your hand up.
Hang on.
There you are.
Yeah, Tommy's made some really interesting points, but I want to tell everybody that, when you do raise, I mean, the general public as a whole is quite unaware of the fact that 80% of our council's money comes from Holyrood. The council tax only raises about 20%, or even less in some cases. So you have to educate the public about that. I think there's also a job of education to do about what is tax for, why do we need it, and where does it go? Because we're seeing this really big narrative driven by the Trumpists in the USA, but it's crossing the Atlantic into the UK political discourse about, there's this kind of assumption with the Daily Mail and the Daily Express that tax is bad, taxation is bad, you've got to keep it in your own pocket. And it's such a short-sighted, narrow position because it speaks to people's individual circumstances when they're doing well, but doesn't tackle the issue, what happens to their son or daughter who might be a student who hits hard times or gets a terminal disease, and then they need a decent welfare state. And we have to really argue that, I think. Yeah. We have to argue that point, that taxation is there for the common good. But when it comes to council tax increases, Tommy, I mean, I've voted at the last budget because I'm in a unique position. I hold the balance of power in Renfrewshire Council, and I have done for the last 8 years. So at the last budget, we put the council tax up by 9%, but we've put it up by 4-5% previously before that. And in the last decade, and the ward I represent covers Johnson Town Centre, which is okay, but it's got some deprived areas in it. It covers 3 villages, Houston, Lochwinner, Kilbarchan and Howwood, which are fairly affluent, and I've got 300 farmers in between the 3 villages. So as a whole, it's a fairly affluent ward. Not once have I ever had an email complaining about voting to raise the council tax, not once. And if anybody ever mentions to me, I go back to them and say, well, look, we did that because, we're going to have a new village hall next year. There's going to be a major investment there. We're going to invest in a new play park in the village. If you want these things, they have to be paid for. Now, people understand that, regardless whether they're left, right, or centre. They understand that when you tell them where the money's going to go and what it's going to be used for, people will come with you. Definitely. Thanks.
Robert, thanks. I think that's a brilliant point Andy's made, and I apologise for butting in, but I think anyone with a heart and a bit of human morality recognises that if you state what the money is being spent on, and it's for the benefit of the general community, then paying extra isn't the problem. What is the problem is if people see money's going in corruption. Money's going, you look at your COVID scandals in terms of the equipment and the Michelle Moans of the world, and people saying, oh, wait a minute, we're spending millions of pounds and look where it's going. I can understand why people don't want to pay that. But if it's for a new school, a new nursery, a new community centre, people will pay more. So I think Andy's absolutely right. We shouldn't be frightened of taxation. Taxation is a tool, an economic tool that allows us to build a better society. And we should never be frightened of taking on that debate.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah. Is there any further questions? Alexander?
You mentioned that we don't want the millionaires to leave the country, and you said that the workers created the wealth. It's not the workers that create the wealth. The millionaires are not going to leave the country. It's the customers that create the wealth. It's the marketplace. McDonald's aren't going to pull out tomorrow because nobody's eating burgers, sort of thing. It's that there's a market there. If they stop eating burgers, yeah, they will pull out. But the market's here. Like say BMW, Britain's the second biggest market for them. So I think we should be taxing the rich. I think we should be taxing the landowners, and I think we should be looking at every company and where they're headquartered, because a lot of these big companies, they're headquartered over in Ireland, they're headquartered over in Switzerland.
Do you know, Alexander, the point I made in the Parliament, and I would make it again today, is I don't really care whether the millionaires threaten to leave. I really don't. If we want to give them bus passes to go, then let's do it. What I was saying in the Parliament is there is an economic piece of philosophy and principle that some of these politicians don't understand. It's called the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume. Sounds maybe a bit difficult, but it's not. What it means is, if you give a millionaire an extra tenner a week, the millionaire's not going to spend it because he's already got all he needs. He'll put it in the bank. Mm-hmm. Give an extra £10 a week to a pensioner, a low-paid worker, a nurse, a teacher. They'll spend it. And that's what the marginal propensity to consume dictates. So that if we put more money in people's pockets via the service tax, our economy will grow. And it will create demand for jobs and services. So it's a win-win situation, Alexander. And I just wish that more parties would be concerned with the millions and not the millionaires.
Aye. I mean, you look at the big four accountancy firms, they're all set up to make sure that these big companies, they can be as tax efficient as possible. We're just getting the wool pulled over our eyes.
Thanks, Alexander. Is there any further questions or comments from anyone in the room or online? Ms. Morgan? You're muted, Morgan.
Yes, sorry, I'm just taking it off. Just a question to Tommy. If you're going to have a centrally set Scottish service tax, wouldn't it just be easier to just incorporate council taxation into income tax and just increase the rate at which income tax is gathered in and then distribute it in the way you said to the councils?
It's two different arguments, Morgan. I mean, what the service tax proposal was all about was analysing what powers do we have short of independence? What can we do now without independence? What you're talking about in terms of income tax as a whole would require full power independence, because we don't have the power over income tax rates at a level at which would be required to effect proper redistribution. So the proposal has to be seen in its context, and the context is within the Scottish Parliament. I do think even within independence, however, to take up the point that you've made, I do think there is a degree of benefit to consider a tax which is dedicated to local government jobs and services. And in my opinion, that tax should be set at a very progressive rate that allows as much money as possible to be generated for local government jobs and services, because without them, we have nothing. Local communities are nothing without local schools, local refuge, local street cleaning, local teachers, local police. We have nothing. So from my point of view, it is a slightly different argument, because it would be about, well, what is the settlement we want in an independent Scotland? But in the here and now, in the Scottish Parliament, I think it is right and proper to have a dedicated tax for local government jobs and services.
No, I understand that, but in reality, it doesn't really make any difference if you have a I mean, it would be another system of taxation on people, along with national insurance and income tax, and it just seems more logical just to simplify. I mean, the problem with the UK as a whole, and obviously Scotland reluctantly part of that at the moment, is that the tax system is far too complicated. we need a simplified tax system. Now, that's something we need in an independent Scotland. Now, I understand, I take your point, but it might be worth trying to explore whether we can get the powers to set an income tax to raise revenue for local authorities. But I understand
we do have that power, Morgan. That's exactly what the service tax is, because the East Kilbride tax centre has the tax code for every single worker in Scotland, every single domicile worker in Scotland. They have the tax codes. Because we did a bit of research, what to do work with the tax centre and with the tax centre workers. I mean, there's a wee statement I want to maybe read out later, which just to finish. One of the unions that backed this campaign was the Public and Commercial Services Union, which is the tax workers union. They backed this proposal because they know that we have those powers and we have the information in Scotland to make it work. But we don't have the ability to affect income tax levels, but we do have the control over local tax levels.
Yeah, well, I take that argument. I mean, I think in an independent Scotland, I would be arguing that you simplified the tax system and you just set income tax at a level that you can ring fence a part of the income tax for it. In an independent Scotland, that might be what I would be arguing for. But I take your point that what we can do here and now is what you're suggesting. And
Morgan,
it would be an improvement.
I've got to say right away,
well,
see in an independent Scotland,
would be an
in an independent Scotland, now we'll have different views here on the panel, and we're allowed to have different views. But in an independent Scotland,
yes,
if the oil, the gas, the electricity is publicly owned and controlled, we could generate more money and lower income taxes for people in Scotland. That's the truth. We have the wealth and the abundance.
I agree with you.
You know, that's why I'm saying to you that this argument is much more about the here and now Scottish Parliament, because in a future independent Scotland, I think we should be saying to people, not only can we give you a better pension, but we can give you lower income tax rates, because we're going to generate revenue from oil and gas that goes into the pockets of the public exchequer, not into the Yankee millionaire pockets that it's going into the now.
Thanks, Tommy. Did I see Andy's hand up or somebody else's hand up there? Is that?
Can I put a scenario to you?
Fire away.
Right. I've got a flat in Aberdeen. I stay up in Fraserburgh. So I go to look to buy a house. I buy a house in Fraserburgh. Normally, a lot of people, when they buy their house first and they sell their original house second. So buy before you sell. That's the normal process. I bought the flat at 107,000. It's now valued at 80,000. I haven't done anything to the flat in terms of demolished it. It's no in disrepair. On the home report, it gets ones all the way through, and EPC is C rating. So I've lost £27,000 straight away. I buy the house in Fraserburgh, 134,000. Scottish Government turn around and say, you've now got two houses. I know that because I want to sell my flat. Right, because you've got two houses, we're going to put 8% tax on you. So that's 11.5 grand that you owe us, and your lawyer will send that to us. Plus the fact you've already lost 27,000 on your flat that you can't sell. I'm snooker, but I've got two houses. Do you understand the scenario there?
Yeah, I can understand it, Alexander. Obviously, it's a bit different from what we've been talking about tonight in terms of a service tax. A service tax is taxing income rather than property. But I do understand that Andy quite rightly is raising land value tax. Land value tax won't necessarily affect house owners, but it should affect landowners who generate an awful lot of money from land that they pay very little, if any, tax on. In relation to the point that you made, I think there is clearly an issue with second homeowners abusing the system across Scotland. There's no doubt about it. but there are also other people who aren't abusing the system. And any good system should have transitory regulations that allow for a situation of the which you're talking about. The idea of taxing second homes is designed primarily for areas with housing shortages, but massive amounts of homes that are lying empty most of the year round because it's rich landowners in other parts of the UK that have these houses. So you are you're not the target for that type of policy.
I'm all for taxing people with second homes, but I'm in an area now that I can't get rid of the flat because it's deprived. And because of the oil boom, and I bought it in 2009. I've had it for 16 years, and I lost 27 grand on it because I bought it at the top of the oil boom because my daughter was going to Robert Gordon University and I was working in Aberdeen. So I'm struggling to sell it. I've got 3 years to sell it. If I can't sell it within 3 years, the Scottish Government will say, right, we're taking that money there. So it's a joke.
Make sure you contact whoever your MSP is, Alexander, and get them on the case, mate, because every piece of legislation, as I say, should have flexibility to deal with exceptional cases.
Aye.
Thanks, guys. I see Lewis has got his hand up. Lewis Atkinson, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask Tommy, your service tax proposal. I know Andy mentions that from the sounds of it, it's largely based on Taiwan's approach. And it's not the only country that's done land value. I know Denmark it's at 3%, roughly 3-4%. Singapore has it's at about 70% on the improved land value. And a few other places as well. So I'd like to ask, was there something, what was the service tax based on? And is there an example of it in the world today or something along those lines?
We were initially inspired, Lewis, by the Nordic example, the Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all of whom have forms of local income tax which are much more progressive, much more redistributive than anything that we have and anything that we were seeing as proposals at the time. It's very, very important that we take on board, for instance, even Germany with the federal system they have lots of federal taxes. And when our professors were given evidence to the Scottish Parliament and the local government committee was trying to argue the whole issue about flight of capital, that people would leave because of these tax rates, our professor says, show us the evidence. Show us the evidence. There was no evidence, absolutely none. And then our professors used the Nordic examples of the Sweden, the Norway, the Denmark, where there was no evidence that higher tax rates in those areas led to people leaving the countries. We have to understand that people live in countries for all sorts of reasons. They have ties to those countries. They have business interests in those countries. So the idea that millionaires are going to get up and leave because we tax them a wee bit more, I just think it's great for Daily Mail readers, and it'll make give the millionaires something to scoff at over breakfast, but it's just rubbish. It's just not going to happen.
Thanks. Got Alan Ross next. Former councillor from Dundee, of course. I think you're muted, Alan.
You're definitely muted, Alan.
You-
Oh, he's waving hand. I don't think you can unmute it.
I don't know, yeah.
He's waving his hand. He's on the Titanic. He's going down. We'll save you, brother. We'll save you.
He's posted a message on chat saying he can't get to his mic.
For goodness sakes.
Is your daughter not around, Alan? You can.
But
Well-
we're of that generation, Robert. We need our daughters to show us how to work these things.
So unfortunately, I can't hear from Alan. But if there's anyone else, if not, we'll kind of take it to a close. I can give both Tommy and Andy a couple minutes just to kind of summarise what they're wanting to talk. Oh, we've got Craig Dempsey from Fife, who will be the kind of last kind of question or observation.
Aye. Really just to back up something that Tommy had said, 3 or 4 years ago, I put in a couple of freedom of information requests. One was to DWP, and the 2 questions I asked was, what was their estimate of benefit fraud and how many dedicated benefit fraud investigators they had? Their estimate was it was between £2 and £3 billion a year, but they had over 3,000 dedicated fraud investigators. I then put a freedom of information into HMRC. The question I asked them was, what is your estimate of tax evasion and how many dedicated tax fraud investigators do you have? Their estimate of the tax that has been avoided was really woolly. It was in between 30 and 60 billion pounds. But interestingly, they had less than 300 dedicated investigators. So that's the billionaires walking right over the top of the poorest in the country once again. But really, my question is, back in 2019, we had Graham McCormick come through to the Kirkcaldy Hub and gave a talk on his ground rent. And it was really interesting. It was, you know, that day when he went away, I was kind of thinking to myself, why has some of this not been instigated already? Because council tax is an absolute joke. So really what I suggest is that we invite Graham McCormick to come along and actually give us a talk on give us more detail on it. Because, you know, the way he gives his demonstration, it does away with all forms of taxation. You're only paying for what you use. It does away with tax fraud and tax evasion because you can't pick up a piece of land and move it to America. You know, you pay for what you've got. So I'd like to suggest that we invite Graham along to actually give us a talk on it.
Thanks a lot, Craig. I think that's a good idea, and it's one certainly the working group can take forward. And Alan's got his hand back up. Can he unmute himself?
It's working, I think, is it?
Hey.
Yeah.
You actually got your daughter, didn't you?
I didn't even, she's not even here, Rob. I managed to figure it out myself. I was going to say maybe it was a load of rubbish I was going to say, and that was why it wasn't working. But anyway, yeah, it was just to say it was just comments really on Tommy's presentation, and really the main reason that I want to see the council tax scrapped and replaced is because of how deeply unfair it is. And I spoke on it at conference earlier this year when Chris and Rob took it as a motion to our conference, and I gave the example of, you know, when I'd been a student and I became unemployed and all I had was my student loan, which, you know, got into thousands of pounds of rent arrears because I couldn't claim housing benefit or anything like that. And then the minute I stopped being a student, I was immediately liable for council tax, which was just, you know, another kick in the, you know, in the nether regions, if you like. And nobody cared, you know. It was like they didn't want to know anything, you know, they didn't care that I was struggling or anything like that at all. And the side of that really gets to me is, you know, I live on my own. So my next door neighbours, my old next door neighbours at the time, who were a couple and both earning well and well-paid jobs, their bill was exactly the same as my bill, based on the value of our property, not based on the value of our income, which, you know, is just so deeply unfair. But the other point that struck out to me was when John Major spoke about the poll tax and it had got to the point where it was uncollectible. I did an FOI on Dundee City Council just after
You've muted yourself again, Alan, somehow.
Sorry, I'm never using my phone for this again. since council tax began, Dundee has got £28 million worth of uncollected council tax debt. And that's just simply because people can't pay it. Because, in circumstances like I was in, again, because your income doesn't come into it, because it's based on the value of your property, people just can't afford to pay it. So there's all these, all the councils this year, I think, raised council tax. In Dundee, it was 8% this year. But in reality, that's stupid anyway, because they're not going to collect it because so many people can't even pay it. It's just a ridiculous system. And yeah, you're obviously pushing it an open door with me here, Tommy. I agree with pretty much everything you said. That's me.
Perfect. I think just that point on that as well. I mean, you would still have to pay council tax if you rent the property, you don't even own it, and so the person next door that could own it obviously usually have a larger income compared to somebody that's perhaps forced to rent as well. So it's another kind of way in which the system is deeply unfair and regressive. But it's just an aside. So I'm happy to pass over to Tommy and Andy if you want to have a couple minutes summing up, and then we can close the meeting if you're happy with that.
All I wanted to do was, this is dead indulgent, Robert. I apologise beforehand, but when I was doing my research and I told you all about the spice, it did come up with the actual debate that took place in Parliament on the 1st of February 2006. And if you don't mind, can I just read a couple of paragraphs? Because I think that it sums up what I was trying to say earlier. The bill will help the vast majority of Scotland's workers and pensioners by removing the humiliating means test and increasing to 10,000 the threshold at which people begin to pay additional local government tax. The bill will also generate extra resources for local government services. The bill is backed by 3 major trade unions: the Public and Commercial Services Union, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union, and the Fire Brigades Union. It's also backed by the respective Scottish Pensioners Forum and by the Poverty Alliance, which represents anti-poverty groups throughout Scotland, and by the Glasgow City branch of Unison, which is the largest trade union branch in Scotland. Those organisations back the bill because it is beneficial to workers, pensioners, and the poor. It affects a redistribution of income that is long overdue. And then the final point is, of course, not everyone will pay less, because we have to raise enough money to pay for local government jobs and services. Every member in the chamber will pay more. On average, MSPs will pay £2,500 more. The multi-millionaires will have to stump up more, including the 277 who live in Edinburgh in postcode district EH4, the 240 who live in Aberdeen, AB15, and the 176 who live in Glasgow in G61. Instead of a piddling 2,800, Mr. Brian Souter, on his £3.24 million income, will pay £641,000. That represents the less than 20% of his salary and leaves him 2.6 million to keep the wolves from the door and 400 million in the bank. Then there is wee Ephran Belcher, a friend of the Tories. Wee Ephran, of Scottish sausage fame, could afford to donate £250,000 to the Tories, so he could afford his new Scottish service tax bill of £555,000. He would survive, given his income of 2.8 million, of which 2.3 million would remain. Of course, he always has the 48 million that is in the bank. So that was the gist of my speech to Parliament. Sadly, the SNP, Labour, Tories and Liberals voted it down because they're more interested, I'm afraid, in the millionaires than they are in the millions.
Thanks, Tommy. And anything from Andy? Final thoughts?
I think this has been a really good debate. I'd really like to say thank you to Alapa and yourself, Robert, for inviting me along. I'm happy talk to Tommy again. It brings back a lot of happy memories in the barricades when we were young and fit and attractive looking here. Instead of being bald and middle-aged. But I think the nub of the debate, the first point I want to make is, when I heard about a year ago, Alpa's position seemed to be, now correct me if I've got this wrong, but what seemed to be coming out in the media was that Alpa's position in local government finance was they want a council tax freeze. Now my heart just completely, absolutely sank at that point, because when the SNP government had the council tax freeze, it didn't really work that particularly well. It was meant to be a holding position because in 2008 the Liberals and Labour voted down the SNP's moves for a local income tax. It was only meant to be a holding position. It went on for far too long. I don't think it was funded properly. It wasn't really good for local government. We can't be in that position again. When Humza Yousaf, and I quite liked Humza, when he was the First Minister and he came out with that announcement, you should have seen the look in the faces of SNP colleagues in Westminster Council. They just said, oh my God, what has he done? So the council tax freeze position is really, it's not a credible position for any party now, especially for a party like Alpa that I think has to be bold and progressive in order to differentiate itself from the SNP and the Greens. I think that's really important. The second point I would make it, about 5 years ago, there was a Plaid Labour coalition in Wales, and the Welsh government did investigations about a land value tax. And what they found resonated with some of the comments that had been made by other people, that they actually found that a land value tax would bring in so much money to the Welsh exchequer, they'd be able to abolish business rates and let local councils keep all of their business rates. So this is a really good debate. Now, whether the difference appears to be the service tax advocated by Tommy would be personal, and some have mentioned already in contributions there's more scope there, I think, for evasion, although that could be tackled. A land tax, in my opinion, would be useful because it wouldn't just be an end in itself. I think a land value tax would be the first step to breaking up the feudal land system, and then the next stage of the policy would really be, let's really look at policies like how do we actually repopulate the Highlands. That's a separate debate for a separate National Assembly. But quite honestly, I think the two are related, and it's all about boosting the Scottish economy and making the Scottish economy as strong as it can be. But Tommy and I, there's a lot of commonality in what we're saying. If you explain to people on the street clearly and concisely what taxation is going to be used for, they will buy it. They won't buy the Daily Mail argument about the milk, the flight, the milk. That's nonsense. Even people that are fairly middle class, fairly well off, if you tell them what it's going to be spent on in their community, and that's why it's gone up, the public will buy that argument. And I think Alpa has to be, again, if you want to be bold, and you should be bold, and you want to differentiate yourself from the SNP, I think you need to look at policies like that.
Perfect. Thanks so very much, Andy, for giving up your evening. And thanks to Tommy, of course, as well. So I think that brings an end to the kind of discussion on replacing unfair council tax. So the next steps for those interested will be kind of forming a relatively short life working group as the election is ever approaching, and formulate our policy ahead of publishing our manifesto and the next conference at the beginning of next year. And so if you're interested in taking part in formulating Alba policy on this issue, then please do get in touch with me via my party email address, robert.reid, that's REID, @albaparty.org. And I'll be convening the first meeting of the working group that will kind of get our teeth into these issues, and perhaps invite the likes of Graham McCormack along as well to outline and articulate their position going forward. And I mean, if you look at some of our best policies in the party, a lot of it has came from working groups of ordinary members coming together bringing forward ideas and debating through the key points. And so this is the first step for that tonight. Like I said, please get in touch if you'd be interested in taking part. And so with that, I'll kind of bring the meeting to a close.